Welcome to another episode of the cut content of Spec Ops The Line. And man, there is a lot to go over because, as you guys have seen in the channel, the 2010 multiplayer demo of Spec Ops The Line recently became public. It was leaked and been posted on archive.org, and within it is a treasure trove of development info from that point in the game's timeline. And there's a lot, even stuff left over from single player, like voice lines for Walker from that point, stuff for the multiplayer mode that didn't make it into the final game, older models of weapons, cut weapons. And what this episode is going to focus on is that we have even more content about Exodus, the cut co-op campaign and versus mode that would have been available. There was a good amount of info that I didn't get the chance to cover in the initial video about it. The coverage of it was already pretty broad, but since that video I'd also caught up on more details. So this is about not only going over the stuff that I missed previously, but also the new info that's been revealed by looking through this 2010 build of Spec Ops. So right out the gate, there are files for both Exodus Co-op and Exodus Versus in this build, in the same way that the different multiplayer modes have their own sections. There would have been bosses in Exodus. Boss classes would have been an option, presumably for the Damned 33rds team, and there would have been messages warning you if there was a boss incoming or if you could play as a boss class, along with class levels. Presumably you'd be able to play as multiplayer classes on the 33rd side, and there are levels 2 through 6 of classes you could unlock. The two factions are the same, still Gray Fox, aka the CIA team, and the Damned 33rd. But what's interesting is that there are voice lines for the Gray Fox team. Castovan isn't included in this build, so I'm guessing he was never planned when Exodus was still in the works. I guess they hadn't come up with him at that point, or maybe he just didn't serve a role within the narrative. Either way, there are no files mentioning him within the narrative or just within the game itself. There are voice lines, placeholder ones, but still voice lines for Faree, the guide of Gray Fox, who briefly appears in a cutscene in Chapter 3 when he's talking to Agent Castovan. Based on the way the mode is structured, it would have been a 3 versus 5 sort of scenario in Versus, and the players would have been Gould, Riggs, and either Daniels or Faree, depending on where you are in the story. At a certain point, Daniels gets captured by the 33rd, and presumably Faree takes over his role, player-wise. There would also be attempts within Exodus, at least for Versus, where the Gray Fox team, also referred to as the Spec Ops team, would have had a certain number of attempts needed to complete their objectives, and they would be warned when they reached their last attempt. Players could customize their own characters in Exodus. I'm not sure if this was just for the Damned 33rd side or if it was also for Gray Fox. But there is an option for custom characters, and it explicitly notes that they'd be used in Exodus. Exodus could also be played co-op and versus through LAN. You'd be able to host matches that way. There are a list of what's called elite challenges that relate to completing objectives and getting rewards out of it, or performing well. There are mentions of completing specialties and having them level up from 1 and 2 and so on, and you would get rewards out of it, like 1 explosive, more health, 2 explosives, and then maxing out the challenge at the 5th point, based on what is available, though that could also be conjecture. There's a full list of multiplayer classes present in the Exodus files. It's unclear if they were all meant to be used in Exodus, or if it's just things being lumped together in the game files. Because if that's the case, it seems like 1 or 2 of the exiles playable characters would have been usable in Exodus, so that much is tough to tell. You could also create private games of Exodus, at least for co-op, and versus as well. There's an overview of the scoreboard. There's a scoreboard for Exodus Versus that would list your distance from the objective, whether you succeeded or failed at it, how much the Gray Fox team scored, how many objectives they cleared, and they would get a bonus if they completed the mission. The total points they had, like a survival bonus, presumably based on whether 1, 2, or 3 members of the team made it all the way to the end, and then it would decide victory based on that. It was also compatible with Windows Live, just to show you how far back it went. There are also listings for PlayStation Network and Xbox Live as well. Another important thing is that there were 2 sets of announcers for Exodus, just like how it was with multiplayer in 2010. It seems like they would have shared the same announcer voice actors, so the announcer for the Exiles also would have commentated for the Gray Fox side, and the Damned would have kept their own announcer. There are also, both within the final game and the beta, there are images, menu previews of Exodus levels, all listed as CS, like 1 or something or another. It breaks down based on the days, because there are 3 days broken up into 3 missions for Exodus. I guess you can think of them as like acts. So you can actually catch glimpses of how the levels looked, or how they would have looked, if you had been able to play them out. It's unclear how far it got in development, but there's voice acting. There are voice lines for Gray Fox in combat, even for Daniels, who doesn't have much of a role in the final game. There are pictures of the levels themselves, rules being set up, and text references and everything. It seems like they got pretty far along. To me, at least, they would have been able to test it out, having made the placeholder lines for Farid at that point. He has a voice actor in the final game, but as far as I know, there are no lines related to Exodus in the final game. All the stuff of Riggs reviving people and using grenades, that's not in the final game, among his own voice lines. So it seems like they at least got mock-ups done of the levels they wanted to make, and we can also get some ideas of how they looked. Like, the level Super Dune was supposed to take place at night, and there are other levels that were going to be set during the day. So all this stuff, it's just fascinating. It feels like it really broadened the knowledge of how far they got in Exodus. I thought they had just gotten the basic concepts done and then moved on, probably to focus more on just the traditional multiplayer experience. But based on this, it looks like they got far enough along to at least be able to test it out. Presumably that's what the text-to-speech voice lines are for, to fill in any blanks. And they even have announcer call-outs for bosses and class unlocks and stuff. You don't do that for something that is just going to be tossed to the side. It seems like they had some confidence that this was going to be moved along, or at least at this point in 2010, about 2 years into the game's development, they had plans to make Exodus work, and they had gotten far enough along to get voice acting done. There's a model for Riggs. There aren't models for the other characters in this build, though. The multiplayer classes that possibly would have been used for Exodus have models, and although there aren't any levels for Exodus included in this, there are still the preview images, both referenced as cross-player and as Exodus. Both of those headings directly relate to the game mode. It's incredible. This has been a gold mine of info about Spec Ops. I'm not even scraping the surface. There's so much else to talk about, and I look forward to doing that. So what do you guys think of this build? What do you think of these findings on Exodus? Do you think that there's a build of Spec Ops where you can play this mode? Do you think that it's possible to restore it? The files are from the Xbox version. I don't know if they would be compatible with the PC, and the PC is also notoriously tough to mod, at least the PC version of Spec Ops, but A friend of mine is reported being able to get editor commands working on PS3 version, so stuff like no-clip has been enabled on his side. So at least that's a positive development. I'd love to hear what you guys think, what speculations you have, and what you think of this new info on the game mode. It sounds like it would have been a lot of fun. It sounds like the versus mode in Left 4 Dead, and the story, from what we know, it looks about the same in this build as well. It feels like it still would have fit the themes of Spec Ops. It wouldn't have clashed as much as Horde mode. But all we can do is just look through this and put the pieces together. Thankfully, we have a lot more pieces to work with, and to me, that's really exciting. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the cut content of Spec Ops: The Line, and take care, everybody.